I first consider Tel Mozan, ancient Urkesh. The site lies near the terminus of the Mardin Pass in the Taurus Mountains front range, the Tur Abdin. What can only be taken as a radical change of lifestyle came about over the first centuries of the 3rd millennium BCE. This change, which was the successful implementation of animal husbandry in the practices of a palace community at Urkesh, would come to characterize the very nature of the urban complex, or as it came to be, the city-state. What had been a trackless steppe, crisscrossed by wandering herds, driven by seasonal exigencies, gave way to a permanent nodal settlement, a central area for the administration of essential services that came to define the region. Now, how is the possibility of such change signaled to the entire population? We might otherwise ask, how does culture accrete? And how does it become, in effect, self-actualizing? The most obvious answer is imposing physical presence. The mud brick walls of Urkesh rose atop the largest stone-founded building in northern Mesopotamia. Its storehouses and courtyards became the hub of processing activities that extended the reach of the polis far beyond regional borders. Eventually, the mound came to dominate the surrounding plain. Its eminence signaled power. This is a very good example of what we might term architecture as marker. For my part, I see this new locale, in its particularity of place, as surrogate, a sort of overlay on a previous reality, called into being by everyday practices. Now that's Bourdieu, the instauration of habitus, or, as de Certeau would have it, an imaginary landscape. The imaginary landscape of inquiry restores popular culture. It keeps before our eyes the structure of a social imagination, remember the word social, in which the problem constantly takes different forms and begins anew. Is this projected image reality for the populace? Well, no, not at first. But it comes into being over time through a series of acts of representation that must have helped individual community members visualize change. A state of being that all can embrace without diminishing the sense of identity or of self. Invariably, these acts involve the making of something, the very concrete practice of construction of an alternate reality that comes to substitute itself for what we may have known. At Urkesh, one representation came from the hands of an artist or artists. In due course, it found its way into a foundation box of Temple BA atop the mound. The image was cast in bronze twice over, creating one of the most memorable and ferocious avatars of societal change to be produced in the ancient Near East. The Urkesh lion, kind of mascot for the ruler and his family, was placed in royal context in terracotta impression. By this point in time, the community thought of themselves, and the way they thought of themselves had changed. They'd become other, something else. They'd taken on a new identity. Those in the shadow of the temple, as it were, linked by shared practices, disparate at the outset, but as time went on, more and more driven by the discovery of common interest. This is what Bourdieu calls the system of dispositions, a past which survives in the present and tends to perpetuate itself into the future by making itself present in practices structured according to its principles. Other markers of change are less prepossessing than the stone temple atop the mound. Hundreds of terracotta figurines make up the corpus at Tel Mozan. Elsewhere, more often than not, these hand-modeled miniature sculptures are summarily cataloged in site reports, and sometimes they're tossed out, and they're not recorded at all. At Urkesh, these small figures made of clay are remarkable for straightforward realism that documents the fauna of the area. They're made by people who know animals. A paleontologist can identify many species by body type and anatomical detail. Now, animals spell livelihood, and their representations testify to their importance. One might think of the Urkesh figurines as a kind of analphabetic couleur, ancient boundary markers that bind and are a negotiable stand-in for the real thing. Moreover, they act as thought-enabling elements, one of whose key roles is to create and maintain surrogate situations, tangible frameworks of a new world order that can be held in the hand. These representations of 6 different animal genera are markers too. As we've seen, we've had architectural monuments, buildings, as markers. So too, these tiny sculptures stand in as a second type of surrogate for reality. Representations as markers. The figurine should be seen as integral to the change, a signal that the population will be henceforward irrevocably, irremediably transformed. They are more than mnemonic devices. First, they presage change, but then they bring change about rather than being the inert stuff of cultural memory. They are power distilled, a dynamic moment, cultural practice, taken in the moment of its making. Harmansha rightly notes in a recent piece on place and memory that the practice of animal husbandry and how it and agricultural production contributed to the settlement economy has been oddly neglected in the literature. Our entanglement in a sort of imperialistic discourse blinds us as to how ordinary peoples fashion and remake their surroundings. Of course, it's tempting to expect every surrogate stand-in to be a replica of reality. However, in yet a third type of surrogate, we find schematic representations of the artifact, graphic overlays as surrogate, in those instances where there are multiples, groups of artifacts that seemingly replicate, but not exactly, reality. When I think of the Urkesh figurines, I always first think of or see these outlines of external form and not the animal they represent. Schematized, they permit me to mark and to measure anatomical differences in a precise way. Ratio and proportion can be determined. We think we recognize an object for what it is, and we're taught to give an object a name and to rank it amongst similar objects. We may subsequently quantify the collection, but investigation often just stops there. In fact, simple comparative measurements might lead us to novel observations about the objects we are holding. That, and ratio and proportion, body part to body part, will tell a more accurate story. Harmansha challenges archaeologists to come to terms with the implications of their field practices. I hope that I'm alert to his caution, and while I understand it, I feel that it is rather a way of seeing that we're missing, rather than ignorance of theoretical paradigms in the literature. Nothing less than visual illiteracy is the culprit, and it is our training institutions that perpetuate calcified analytic tradition. For my part, I see this new locale and its multiple miniature iterations as surrogate, called into being by everyday practices. In this case, the domestication of species.